So in theory, we talk about 4 different types of communication: passive, assertive, aggressive, and passive aggressive. And we all do a mix of all of them, and all of them kind of have their place. All of them have their reasoning. And what we tend to find is that maybe you'll fall into one as your kind of go-to, and often we'll have picked one up from the people who are around. So if your parents are particularly have a dynamic where one is passive and one's aggressive, or one's very assertive and one's very passive aggressive, or whatever, you'll have picked that up from whoever you've watched as you've grown up. So assertive is knowing what you want and being able to clearly state what you want, but listening as well and being responsive to what the other person says. You know, it's not the same thing in every situation. The power dynamic's different, the background is different, everything, all the context going into the situation is different. So this one-size-fits-all idea of assertiveness may not be helpful. And some people might be really assertive with their friends, but not at all assertive in the workplace, because power dynamics and context make a big difference. If you're passive all the time, people might like you because you're always doing what they want to do, but in the long term you're going to build up resentment against them. So some people may find that they recognise the same communication style as me growing up, which was passive, 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 resentment building up, building up, building up, building up, building up, blowing up over something. And that doesn't necessarily mean I was suddenly aggressive. It might just mean that I burst into tears over something really small and got really upset, and everyone was like, where has this come from? And then back to passive. And that's quite common, that people will flip-flop between the two because the pressure just builds up. Although it seems like you've got lots of good relationships, because you're resenting, they're not, and you don't feel like you've got people who are really close to you. So they can link together like that. When you're aggressive, you might get what you want in the short term, but you're destroying relationships to get there. I've tried to be assertive in a situation and I've got aggression back because the other person is not used to that boundary being enforced. And that's often what's quite difficult about it. When we've talked about passiveness being a response to trauma, you sometimes have to push through someone being aggressive back at you whilst you establish a new boundary and you hold it firm, because people are used to you giving it in. Because we absolutely need to accept the fact that society means that we sometimes can't just be assertive and everything's fine. If you're working in a job and you need that income, and it's a service level job, and they're being aggressive to you, and you can't take the risk of, well, I'm going to be assertive and stand up for my rights and go through whatever patchy HR exists only to be dismissed with some other reason that they can come up with to get rid of me, then you're not gonna, you know, it's not gonna work. It's often about trying to be assertive, but with that element of giving, where we try and understand where parents are coming from, but often with a huge extra dollop of, is now the right time to have the conversation. There are things about my mental health over the last 10 years that I haven't told my parents about because it wasn't the right relationship for that to be said. I've talked to therapists about it, I've talked to Tim about it, I've talked to friends who understood about it, and they were much better placed to be able to deal with it than if I talked to my parents about it, who lived 4 hours away and would have just worried and struggled with it. It just wasn't the right, you know, you don't have to share everything with everyone, which is something it took me a while to learn. It's not a bad relationship that I have with my parents just because I don't tell them everything. I'm pretty sure they don't tell me everything. Here's the thing, I've been with my therapist for like nearly 4 years now. I get confused about when we actually started doing it, 3.5 years. And I always say to her, like, oh, I can be so open here now. And she's like, when you started, it was like trying to work with a boulder. Like, I would tell her nothing. I wouldn't open up at all. It took me so long to get to the point where I could open up to my therapist. And she was far from being my first therapist. It took me a long time to get to the point where I found someone I could open up with, and then for her to get me to the point where I can open up with. So yeah, therapy is not as easy as people make it out, and that's even when you can get to it. My cardiologist was the kind of doctor who didn't like being told things about his job, which to some extent I imagine none of us do. We've spent a lot of time learning things to get to that point. Many, many years of medical school and internships and residencies and whatever else they're called. So, you know, it's your specialism. You want to think you know about it. But actually, certain conditions don't have a huge amount of research into them. We don't really know them that well, and it might be that even a specialist has only spent a certain amount of time learning about each specific condition that they might come across. So sometimes if you go in there and you've done all your research and you're really assertive and you say, I think I have this because I have these symptoms, and what I would like is this test and this test, because you've looked up that's what's necessary. Sometimes, as we've spoken about before, that can be interpreted as passive aggressive or aggressive. So sometimes when you have a condition that means that people think that you're going to be aggressive, or you're going to be manipulative or whatever, or you're what we used to call in A&E, which I really hated, a frequent flyer who comes in to A&E a lot, usually because there's either an underlying cause that we've not found, or there's a social care issue that is not being dealt with by the fact that we have a completely shot social care system in this country. They just look at you and go, oh, it's nothing, and don't listen to you properly. You're being aggressive even though you're just being assertive. And so those patients end up being more passive to try and please the people they're trying to get help from, which is really difficult. When I used to go for mental health support, I used to be really assertive, but it was all verbal. I was going, I feel this, and I feel this, and I feel this, and this is a symptom, and this is how often it happens, and I was following all my rules, but I wasn't showing them. I didn't look upset, I didn't look depressed, I didn't look anxious. I was sat still in a chair, you know, I wasn't visibly showing any of their symptoms, and so they all decided that I didn't have them, which is difficult. There's a thing around a distrust around, you have to show it or we don't believe you. You know, recording your symptoms and knowing what you want to ask for, and, you know, doing the broken record, which we spoke about, where you just kind of keep repeating what you want, and if they refuse it, that you ask that they record that they've refused it and their reason why. Taking someone else with you can often be helpful. So if I take Tim with me to an appointment, I took Bryn with me to some mental health appointments so that they could be like, she's not lying. We've seen her when she's not guarded and when she's not defensive, and she's genuinely struggling with these things. And that can be helpful. Just having another person in the room does make a healthcare professional be like, hey, if this comes up again, somebody else was here to corroborate the evidence. Exactly. You can always walk out of an appointment. You know, you don't have to continue an appointment with someone if you're not getting somewhere. I know that's easier if it's someone that you don't see very often, or you're seeing for a one-off. Same with technology as well, around being able to interpret tone. I had one of my relationships, one of my long-term friendships, basically entirely conducted over text, and it was really difficult, and it caused lots of arguments because we couldn't interpret the tone, and also we didn't know where each other were. So if someone was being snippy with you, it could be that they were out in the pub with people and they were trying to, you know, have a conversation with you, but also they were in a place with people where they couldn't respond straight away. So it's so easy to interpret something in the incorrect way. I'm liking Moose's so-called comments so much. What does it say? Hey, why do serious apologies feel like pulling out your teeth and eating them? Yeah. Or teeth is a weird thing for me. Yes, and people have very much addressed it, and it's that sort of making yourself... It's an invitation to be vulnerable. Yeah. And everything about our evolution has said, don't do that, don't be vulnerable. That's when people eat you. We're also really friggin' bad at actually forgiving ourselves after we've done it. So apologies feel awful because a lot of the time you say you're sorry because you know, you want it to make a difference, and then you're still judging yourself for the thing that you did afterwards. Even if someone else has forgiven you, you're still holding on to it. So it feels like a lose-lose situation. Like, you make yourself feel really vulnerable, and then you still feel shit afterwards a lot of the time. So learning to forgive ourselves is a big thing as well.